got husband out, then did the unbelievable to her own kids. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. The air inside the house felt thick, heavy, almost suffocating. Samantha stood by the window, her fingers gripping the curtains, pulling them tighter. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, eerily quiet. She had just sent him away. Her husband. He was gone, leaving a silence that felt louder than any argument they'd ever had. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady her breath. The house now felt like a cage, empty yet full. Her children were in the next room. She could hear their voices, laughing, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the door. But Samantha knew. She knew what was coming. She turned and walked toward the kitchen. The cool tiles under her feet were a stark contrast to the warmth spreading through her chest. There was something unsettling in the calmness of the house. Something had changed. In the dim light, the kitchen looked almost too perfect. The countertops were spotless, the smell of fresh bread hanging in the air. But there was an undercurrent of tension, a thin layer of dread that seemed to coat everything she touched. Her footsteps echoed as she made her way to the drawer. The knife felt heavier than usual in her hand. It was just a small knife, but in her grip, it seemed to have grown. She walked back toward the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. The kids were playing oblivious. Their laughter echoed in her ears, so innocent, so pure. But Samantha's mind was elsewhere. The decisions she'd made, the plans she'd crafted in the silence of the house, were now ready to unfold. She stood behind them, the tension rising with each passing second. She reached out, and then, in a swift motion, she did the unbelievable. The world seemed to freeze. The sounds of the house, the ticking clock, the kids' laughter, became muffled, distant. Her breath quickened, and for a brief moment, she couldn't comprehend what she had just done. The knife was still in her hand. Her hands were shaking. But the deed was done. The house that had once been full of life and warmth now felt like a tomb. Samantha's actions, unimaginable just hours before, had shattered everything. And there was no turning back. The silence that followed was unbearable. It pressed in from all sides, suffocating her. Her children, still unaware, remained in their little bubble of innocence. They were too young to understand, too trusting of their mother. But Samantha could feel their eyes on her now, the weight of their gaze suddenly heavy. She turned slowly, as if moving through a thick fog. Her mind raced, but everything felt oddly detached. The knife in her hand felt foreign, like it didn't belong there. Her pulse was deafening in her ears, but she couldn't stop. Her feet carried her, step by step, toward the living room. The air felt colder now, sharper, as though the house itself was reacting to her actions. The children were looking at her, their faces lit by the fading sunlight. "Mom?" one of them asked, their voice tinged with confusion. She froze. Her body trembled, as if trying to rebel against what she had just done. But there was no turning back. Samantha's throat tightened. She couldn't find the words to explain. The reality of the moment hit her like a freight train. But the look in her children's eyes told her everything. The terror, the confusion, the betrayal, it was all there. And it was more than she could handle. She dropped to her knees, the knife falling from her hand with a soft clink against the hardwood floor. Her breath came in shallow, rapid gasps. Her chest felt like it was being crushed. "Why, Mom?" The voice of her youngest echoed through the room, sharp and innocent. Samantha couldn't answer. She couldn't explain why she had done it. All she could do was stare at her children, the weight of her own actions sinking deeper with every passing second. The house was still, almost too still, but beneath the surface, everything was crumbling. And in that silence, the real horror began to take root. The question hung in the air, heavy with desperation. "Why, Mom?" Samantha's chest tightened, as if a vice were clamping down on her heart. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in on her, suffocating her with the unbearable weight of her actions. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her children stood there, eyes wide with confusion and fear, unable to comprehend the truth of what had just happened. They didn't know why she had done it, but they would soon learn. Her hand trembled as she reached for the fallen knife, but it felt like someone else's hand. Her movements were slow, clumsy, as if her body itself was revolting against the darkness she had unleashed. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door opening. Her heart lurched. She knew who it was. Her husband, returning home, oblivious to the nightmare she had set in motion. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, closer. And with each step, Samantha's anxiety swelled. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, as if trapped in a dream she couldn't escape. Her husband appeared in the doorway, his eyes scanning the scene, not yet understanding the gravity of what was unfolding. "Sam? What's going on here?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. Samantha opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The horror of the situation left her speechless. The children remained motionless, their faces pale, their eyes glued to their mother. The tension in the room was unbearable, each second dragging on like an eternity. Her husband's gaze flicked from Samantha to the children and then back again. His eyes narrowed in confusion, his brow furrowing as he tried to piece together the scene in front of him. But then, as his gaze landed on the knife at her feet, the truth dawned on him. A sharp intake of breath, a look of disbelief. "Samantha," his voice faltered, the weight of her actions finally hitting him. For a moment, everything stopped. The house, the air, the very ground beneath her feet, it all seemed to freeze. And then, with terrifying clarity, Samantha realized she couldn't undo it. She couldn't take back the horror she had set in motion. The door was locked, the escape routes closed. Her actions had carved a path from which there would be no return. The room, once filled with the innocence of childhood and family, now stood as a monument to destruction. And in the silence that followed, the true horror began to unfold. One that would haunt them all for the rest of their lives. Her husband's eyes widened, his voice faltering as he took a step back. He stumbled, unable to fully process what was happening in front of him. "Sam, please, what did you do?" The words hung in the air like poison, each syllable dripping with disbelief and horror. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow and frantic. But she still couldn't speak. The words, the reasons, everything was lost, buried beneath the weight of her actions. The children looked up at her, their tiny faces filled with confusion and growing fear. Their little hands trembled, clutching each other for reassurance that no longer existed. Samantha's mind raced, but nothing made sense anymore. Her thoughts were fragmented, like broken glass scattered across the floor, and she couldn't piece them together. What had driven her to this moment? What had pushed her over the edge? The sound of her husband's voice brought her back to reality, but it felt distant, muffled. "Call an ambulance, Sam," he urged, panic creeping into his voice. But it wasn't the children who needed saving. Her husband's gaze flickered toward the knife again, and then back to her, his expression one of utter betrayal. He took a tentative step forward, reaching for her, as if trying to bridge the chasm between them. But his hand never made it. Samantha felt her body go cold, her limbs heavy. Her heart beat painfully in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. And for the first time, she understood. She understood that no apology, no explanation, could ever undo the damage she had caused. The room was still, the tension unbearable. Outside, the sky had darkened completely, and the moon cast an eerie glow through the window. But inside, the light was gone. She felt the weight of her husband's gaze on her, but it didn't reach her. Nothing could reach her now. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she dropped to the floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. She had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone, no matter how much she wanted to turn back. Her husband stood motionless, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. The children, still frozen, watched their mother, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to react. Samantha's mind shattered, each piece falling into darkness. Her eyes were glazed, her thoughts no longer her own. And in the silence that followed, the weight of her actions pressed down on them all, suffocating them in a nightmare they couldn't escape. It was too late for redemption. The unthinkable had been done. The silence stretched on, unbearable, suffocating. Samantha's mind swirled in a haze of panic and regret. but the reality of what she had done kept crashing down on her in waves. Her husband was still standing in the doorway, his body rigid with shock. He didn't move toward her. He didn't speak. He simply stared, his eyes filled with a sorrow too deep to be voiced. The children, once so full of life, were now eerily quiet. Their innocent faces, once full of trust, now showed a glimpse of something far darker: fear, confusion, a fracture of their childhood. And in that fractured moment, Samantha realized she had stolen something from them, something irreplaceable. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow, ragged. She wanted to say something, anything, but her throat was dry, the words stuck like stones. Her husband's face was a blur, his expression changing from disbelief to something far worse: anger, betrayal. But even that didn't reach her. Nothing did. Not anymore. She felt herself slipping away, each breath becoming harder to take, each second longer than the last. The house around her seemed to close in, the walls growing tighter, the air more suffocating. The sound of footsteps broke the stillness. Her husband finally moved, not toward her, but toward the children. His hand gently brushed against their heads, trying to offer comfort he couldn't give. "Samantha, what have you done?" His voice cracked, the words barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of everything he was feeling. Samantha looked at him then, her gaze distant. Her body was numb, her mind too far gone to comprehend the full magnitude of what she had unleashed. Her eyes locked onto his for a fleeting moment, but there was no recognition, no apology in her stare. She was lost, adrift in a sea of her own making. The tension in the room thickened, the air heavy with unsaid things. Her husband's hand hovered over his phone, but he didn't make the call. Not yet. Perhaps somewhere deep down, he was hoping for something, anything, that could change what had happened. But it was too late. Samantha knew it. He knew it. And the children, their faces said it all. As her husband turned to them, her gaze lingered on the floor, on the knife that still lay there, an ever-present reminder of the irrevocable act. She wanted to reach for it, to somehow undo the damage. But she couldn't. Nothing could fix this. Not the apologies, not the tears. This moment, this unbearable silence, would haunt them all forever. The room was quiet again, but the silence now carried a new weight, a new terror. A family shattered, a trust destroyed. And in the darkness, where hope had once resided, only emptiness remained. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as if the very air around them had turned cold. Samantha's eyes flickered to the knife again, but the thought of it only deepened the emptiness inside her. Her hands, still trembling, lay useless by her side, unable to undo the horror she had caused. Her husband knelt beside the children, his voice barely audible as he spoke to them, trying to comfort them. But the words didn't seem to matter anymore. The children's eyes were wide, their innocence forever tainted by what they had witnessed. Their trust, so pure and unbroken moments ago, was now a distant memory. Samantha felt herself losing grip on reality. Her body ached, her mind numb. She couldn't process what had just happened, couldn't understand how her life had spiraled into this nightmare. Her husband stood, his face pale, and finally reached for his phone. His hands were shaking. It felt like the world around them was crashing down in slow motion. He spoke into the phone, his voice thick with disbelief. Yes, we need help. My wife. She's hurt the children." The words hit Samantha like a slap to the face, but they were true. The realization sank in slowly, each word cutting deeper than the last. She had done this. She had caused this pain. Her heart hammered in her chest. And yet, there was a strange sense of numbness that settled over her. She couldn't escape it. Her husband hung up the phone, his face etched with grief and anger, but there was no love in his eyes now. It was gone. All of it. In its place was something colder, something harder. He turned to her, his gaze sharp, accusing. "Samantha, what the hell happened to you?" His voice broke, and she could hear the tremor of pain, the rawness of a man who had just lost everything. Samantha didn't respond. She couldn't. The words wouldn't come. She simply stared, empty, at the ground, at the knife, at the children who were now crying, unsure of what was happening to their world. In that moment, everything she had ever known, her family, her love for them, seemed to shatter, leaving nothing but shards of a broken life. The doorbell rang. It was quiet, but in the stillness of the house, it sounded like thunder. Her husband hesitated for a moment before walking to the door, leaving Samantha alone in the room with the children. She heard voices from the other side of the door, the murmur of strangers. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. Samantha didn't know how long she sat there, her mind lost in a fog of regret and horror. It could have been minutes, hours, or even days. Time had lost its meaning. The children's sobs slowly faded, and the house, which had once been filled with laughter and life, was now nothing but an empty shell, echoing with the remnants of what it used to be. Samantha felt as though she were outside of herself, watching as her life unraveled beyond her control. Her husband returned to the room, 2 officers at his side. They moved toward her, their faces impassive, but their eyes told a different story. They didn't need to ask questions. They already knew. The room was no longer hers. It belonged to them now, the strangers, the law, the reality that could no longer be ignored. Samantha stood up slowly, her body moving without her consent. She walked toward them, numb, as though walking through a dream, the consequences of her actions finally beginning to sink in. Her husband didn't look at her. The officers didn't speak. And the children, their broken eyes stayed with her long after the door closed behind her. As they led her away, Samantha realized with sickening clarity that she would never return to the life she once had. The darkness she had invited into their home would stay with them all, haunting them forever. And she would never escape the consequences of what she had done. The cold air outside was a sharp contrast to the stifling heat inside the house. Samantha felt it, the chill that seemed to cut right through her. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. As the officers guided her down the front steps, her thoughts remained a blur. The weight of the handcuffs on her wrists was a grim reminder of the irreversible steps she had taken. Each step felt like a mile, the ground beneath her feet heavy with the consequences she could never undo. Her husband remained inside, the door closing softly behind her. She couldn't see him anymore, but she knew. He was shattered, broken, like 1,000 pieces of glass scattered on the floor. And the children, the innocent faces she had betrayed, they would carry the weight of this forever, just as she would. The world outside felt distant, unreal. It was as if she were no longer a part of it. The cars passing by, the voices of people going about their daily lives. None of it mattered. She had severed her ties with it all. They placed her in the back of the squad car, the door closing with a finality that echoed in her ears. The engine roared to life, and the car began to move, taking her away from everything she had known. Through the window, she could see the house growing smaller, fading into the distance. But it wasn't just the house. Her entire life was shrinking, becoming a distant memory. A life that had been torn apart by her own hands. The officer beside her remained silent, but she could feel his gaze on her, a quiet judgment in his eyes. He didn't need to speak. The silence between them said everything. The car drove on, through streets that felt unfamiliar, alien. And in that strange, suffocating silence, Samantha was left alone with the realization of what she had done. She had destroyed the very thing she had once held most dear. No one would ever look at her the same way again. She had erased her own humanity in one irreversible moment. Her family, her husband, her children, they would never be the same, and neither would she. As the car pulled into the station, Samantha couldn't look back anymore. She had crossed the line. She had sealed her fate. The officers escorted her inside, but she barely noticed. Her mind was far away, trapped in the haunting images of what she had done. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the suffocating guilt that would follow her forever. This was the moment where everything ended, and in its place, there would only be darkness. The station felt cold, sterile, like a place where memories went to die. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow on everything. The walls, the floors, the people, all of it felt distant, disconnected. Samantha was led down a narrow hallway, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, but it didn't register. Nothing registered anymore. Her mind kept returning to the same images, the same fragments of her life that had led her here. Her children's faces, so full of love and trust, now forever scarred by her betrayal. Her husband, standing in the doorway, disbelief and pain etched into every line of his face. And the knife, always the knife, lying there like the harbinger of everything that had gone wrong. The officer ushered her into a small interrogation room. The door clicked shut behind her, locking her inside. The cold metal chair was uncomfortable beneath her, but she couldn't bring herself to care. Time seemed to stretch on forever as she sat there, alone, drowning in the silence. Every second was a reminder of the choices she had made. She could still hear the echo of her children's voices, the questions they had asked her, but the words had no meaning anymore. A moment later, the door opened. A detective stepped in, his face neutral, his eyes scanning her like she was just another case. He took a seat across from her, setting a folder down on the table between them. The folder was thick, too thick, and Samantha could almost feel the weight of everything inside it. "Ms. West," he began, his voice calm, but there was a sharpness to it, as if he already knew everything. "We need to talk about what happened." She didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The detective pushed the folder toward her, but she didn't look at it. She couldn't. She already knew what was inside. The evidence. The proof. The irreversible truth. "Samantha," he said again, his voice softer this time, as if he was trying to break through to her. But she couldn't let him in. She couldn't let anyone in. The room felt smaller, suffocating once again. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the images, the sounds, the reality of what she had done. But it wouldn't stop. It was like a constant loop playing in her mind, each scene replaying over and over again, as if the universe itself was forcing her to face it. The detective sighed and stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the door, pausing before leaving the room. "We'll be back," he said quietly. And with that, he was gone. Samantha sat there, staring at the empty chair across from her. She couldn't escape the feeling that this was it, that this was the end of everything. The walls closed in once more, and she felt like she was drowning in her own guilt. There was no turning back now. The life she had known was gone, shattered beyond repair. Her future, whatever remained of it, was uncertain, tainted by the darkness she had unleashed. And for the first time, she truly understood the full weight of her actions. There was no escape from the nightmare she had created. Only the crushing realization that this was her new reality. And it would haunt her, forever. Samantha sat in the interrogation room, her mind a blur of fragmented thoughts, but none of them brought clarity. Her world had shrunk to this small, cold space. The noise of the bustling police station felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else's life. Time seemed to stretch into infinity, but the seconds were only reminders of the irrevocable changes she had made. The door opened again, but this time it wasn't the detective. It was her husband. Her heart dropped, the weight of his presence filling the room. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with red, but there was something else in them now. Something cold. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, staring at her, as if trying to process the person she had become. The man she once knew seemed so far away. Samantha wanted to speak, to beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was tight, constricted with the pain of knowing it was too late. Too late for words. Too late for apologies. Her husband took a deep breath, his jaw clenched, before he finally broke the silence. "Samantha, do you realize what you've done?" His voice was quiet, but the weight of it felt like a punch to her chest. He wasn't just speaking to her. He was speaking to the woman he once loved, the mother of his children, the person she no longer was. She closed her eyes, not wanting to see the expression on his face, not wanting to feel the sting of his disappointment. "I never thought it would come to this," he continued, his voice cracking under the strain of the words. "I never thought you could hurt us like this." She heard the pain in his voice, the shattered trust that could never be rebuilt. Her heart ached, but the truth was there, staring at her. She had crossed a line that could never be undone. Her husband finally spoke again, softer this time, his voice filled with quiet sorrow. "I don't know who you are anymore, Sam. I don't know what happened to you." Samantha's chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had no answers, only emptiness. The woman he once knew, was she gone forever? Had the darkness consumed her so fully that nothing remained of the person she used to be? He turned away, heading for the door, but paused for a moment. "Get the help you need. For you. For the kids." With that, he left. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving her alone again. She couldn't escape it. The weight of her actions, the echoes of his words. For the first time in years, Samantha felt completely untethered from reality. She had lost everything. Her family, her identity, her future. All of it was slipping through her fingers. And there was nothing left but the cold, suffocating silence. The darkness that had taken hold of her seemed endless. She would never be the same, and neither would the people she had once called her own. There was no coming back from this. She had sealed her fate. Samantha stared at the closed door, the silence pressing in on her like a physical weight. Her heart thudded in her chest, but it felt distant, detached. The room around her seemed to shrink, the walls closing in until it felt like she couldn't breathe. She had always imagined that a moment like this would feel different, more chaotic, perhaps. But instead, it was a strange calm that settled over her, like the quiet after a storm. Only she couldn't find solace in it. Her husband's words kept echoing in her mind, each one a jagged reminder of everything she had lost. Get the help you need. But what kind of help could undo what she had done? Could therapy, or counseling, or even time heal the deep, irreparable damage she had caused? The door opened again, but it wasn't her husband this time. A uniformed officer stepped in, his expression impassive. He stood there for a moment, as if assessing her, before taking a seat at the table. "Ms. West," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. "We're going to need your full statement." Samantha didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was a haze of confusion and regret, too tangled to form coherent thoughts. What could she say? The officer gave her a moment, then spoke again. "I know this is difficult, but the truth is all that can help you now." Her eyes flicked to the table, where a stack of papers lay. It felt like everything was laid out in front of her, her entire life reduced to this one moment, this one set of actions. The consequences were clear, yet somehow distant. He pushed the papers toward her, the sound of the folder opening a sharp contrast to the heavy silence that hung between them. "Take your time. Write it down." Samantha didn't move at first, her hand hovering over the pen, unsure of where to begin. What could she say that would ever make sense of what she had done? What could she write that would explain the unexplainable? The officer sat quietly, waiting, but there was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet expectation. Samantha finally picked up the pen, her fingers cold and unsteady. It felt like an eternity as she tried to gather the words, but nothing came. She couldn't make sense of her own actions. The minutes passed in tense silence, each one a reminder of the life she had destroyed. Her thoughts swirled in a vortex of guilt and sorrow, each memory sharper than the last. She had failed them. She had failed herself. The officer didn't rush her, and she appreciated the quiet patience, even if it did nothing to ease the ache in her chest. Samantha's gaze fell to the paper again, and slowly, as if each word were a weight she could no longer carry, she began to write. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't a confession. It was just the truth, the painful, unrelenting truth that would haunt her for the rest of her life. By the time she finished, her hand was cramped and her mind exhausted. But the paper was there, her final attempt to put her broken thoughts into some form of order. The officer nodded once, gathering the papers. He didn't look at her directly, but Samantha could feel the weight of his gaze as he stood and walked to the door. He paused before exiting, offering a small, almost imperceptible sigh. "I'm sorry, Ms. West," he said quietly, as if he could sense the depth of her despair. "But we have to follow through with the process. For everyone involved." The door closed behind him, and the room once again fell into that heavy silence. Samantha sat back, the weight of everything pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. She couldn't escape the feeling that her life, as she had known it, was slipping away, disappearing into a void that she would never be able to fill. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was the moment she would carry with her forever. The moment where everything ended. The silence in the room was deafening, but it was a silence that Samantha had come to know all too well. It was the kind of silence that fills every corner, suffocating any chance of peace. She stared at the blank wall in front of her, the harsh fluorescent lights above casting an unforgiving glow. Her mind swirled, but it felt as though it were locked inside a fog, unable to break free from the weight of everything she had done. Every moment felt like a distant echo, a fading memory of a life that had once been full of warmth and love. But now there was only this cold, sterile room and the unrelenting reality of her actions. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together, her nails digging into her palms as if the physical pain could somehow erase the emotional torment. But it didn't work. The guilt, the horror of what had happened, wouldn't let her go. She thought back to the moments before everything had spiraled out of control. The frustration, the anger, the isolation she had felt in the weeks leading up to that fateful day. But those thoughts only made it worse. There was no justification. Her children's faces, those innocent eyes now haunted by the image of their mother's betrayal, played in her mind again. The image of their confusion, their pain, the way they had looked at her as if they no longer recognized the woman who had once been their protector. She wanted to scream, to break free from the prison of her own mind, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing she could say that would ever make this right. There was no undoing what she had done. The door opened again, and this time, 2 officers entered, their presence filling the room with the weight of finality. They didn't speak, didn't need to. They had come for her. Samantha's heart beat erratically in her chest as they moved toward her, their footsteps measured, purposeful. The officer in the lead spoke softly, but his words still felt like a hammer to her chest. "You're being transferred now." She nodded, though she wasn't sure why. There was nothing left to say, no fight left in her. She had no strength, no will to resist. She had already given up everything that mattered. As they guided her down the hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the empty space. Each step felt like a mile, each one carrying her further away from the life she once knew. The officers didn't hurry, but Samantha felt as though time was slipping through her fingers. There was no rushing this moment, no escape from the inevitable. Her life had unraveled, and now she was just a passenger on a road she had no control over. They reached the door, and for a brief moment, she thought she might hear the sound of her family's voices, a distant memory of warmth and love. But it was only the cold, mechanical buzz of the locks behind her. The door shut with a final click, and in that moment, Samantha realized with crushing clarity. This was it. This was the end. The beginning of the rest of her life would be marked by the consequences of her choices, and there would be no going back. Her story, the one she had once told herself, was over. And all that was left was the haunting question. How could she ever live with herself again? The door slammed shut, the sound reverberating in the cold hallway as Samantha was led away. Her mind raced, but her body felt numb, moving on autopilot as if she were watching herself from a distance. The officers led her to another section of the station, the air heavier here, thicker with the anticipation of what was to come. The walls seemed to close in around her with each step. The weight of the past hours hung over her, suffocating, unyielding. As they reached the holding area, Samantha's thoughts were a tangled mess. She had once been a mother, a wife, a person who thought she knew herself. But now she was a criminal, a name on a list, a shadow of the woman she used to be. The officers didn't look at her as they processed her, their actions quick, efficient, almost robotic. They had done this before, countless times. But for Samantha, it felt like the world was falling apart, piece by piece, as if she were being erased from existence. Her mind kept returning to the faces of her children, their innocence and confusion, their eyes full of questions she would never be able to answer. And then there was her husband. What would he do now? How would he live with the knowledge that the woman he had trusted had betrayed them all? She wished she could cry, Release all the pain, the sorrow that gnawed at her insides. But the tears wouldn't come. It was as if she had run out of everything: hope, remorse, even the ability to feel. One of the officers spoke to her, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. "You'll be processed here. Then you'll be moved to the county facility. It's going to be a long road." Samantha nodded, her mind too clouded to respond, her thoughts drifting aimlessly like a leaf caught in a storm. They led her into a small, sterile cell, its cold, bare walls a sharp contrast to the warmth of the life she had once known. The door clanged shut behind her, the sound echoing in her chest, marking the finality of everything. The room was small, too small, the bed a thin, uncomfortable mattress, the only furniture a metal toilet in the corner. Everything in the cell was functional, but stark. There was no comfort, no softness. There was only the cold, hard reality of her situation. Samantha sank onto the bed, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind still racing. But the exhaustion wouldn't let her think. Her eyes closed, and for a moment, she wished it was all just a nightmare. But it wasn't. It was real, and she had done this. The minutes stretched into hours, and soon the darkness of the cell became all-encompassing. Samantha lay in the stillness, the silence deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of the station outside. In that suffocating solitude, she found herself wondering, what now? Could she ever make amends? Would she ever be able to look her children in the eyes again? Or was that trust forever shattered? But deep down, she knew the truth. She had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The choices she made had sealed her fate, and the long road ahead of her would be a reminder of that. Each step a painful acknowledgement that there was no going back. Samantha lay in the darkness of the cell, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. Her thoughts were heavy, swirling in a haze of guilt, shame, and regret. Every corner of her mind was consumed with the questions she would never have answers to. What had happened to her? How had she become the person who could do such unspeakable things to the people she loved most? And now, as the reality of her situation settled in, she understood there was no escaping it. This was her life now. The cell felt even smaller in the darkness, the walls closing in tighter with each passing second. Her heart pounded in her chest, the steady beat almost deafening in the oppressive quiet. The coldness of the room seeped into her bones, but it wasn't the chill of the air that made her shiver. It was the weight of everything she had done, the unbearable realization that she would never be able to undo the damage. She thought of her children again, their faces so full of love and trust, now stained by the horror of their mother's actions. Would they ever forgive her? Could they? The minutes turned into hours, and soon the quiet of the cell became a constant companion, wrapping around her like a blanket, suffocating in its stillness. The pain in her chest was all-consuming. She couldn't escape it, no matter how hard she tried. She tried to focus on something, anything that might bring some semblance of peace. But all she could see was the aftermath of what she had done, the shattered pieces of a life she could never put back together. Her mind wandered back to that moment, the one that had set everything in motion, the argument with her husband, the frustration, the feeling of being trapped, unheard. But none of that could justify what she had done. There was no excuse. And now, it felt as though she was drifting in an endless void, a place where redemption no longer existed. Her breathing slowed, though her thoughts continued to race. Time had become irrelevant in the isolation of the cell. Each second felt like a year, each minute an eternity. But despite the endless darkness, one thing was clear. She would have to live with the consequences of her actions for the rest of her life. The thought of facing her children again, of looking them in the eyes, filled her with dread. Would they hate her? Would they ever understand what had led her to this point? Or would they only see the monster she had become? The door to her cell clanged open suddenly, startling Samantha out of her thoughts. A voice from the outside called out her name. It was the officer from earlier, the one who had processed her. "Ms. West," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's time." Samantha stood slowly, her legs unsteady as though the weight of her actions had physically drained her. She stepped toward the door, feeling the cold, hard floor beneath her feet. The officer didn't say anything else, simply motioning for her to follow. As she walked down the dimly lit hallway, her footsteps echoed in the empty space, each one a reminder of how far she had fallen. The station felt even colder now, its sterile, lifeless atmosphere suffocating her as she was led through its maze of hallways. She wasn't sure where they were taking her, but it didn't matter anymore. She had already lost everything. Her family, her identity, her future gone. The door to a different room opened, and the officer gestured for her to step inside. It was another stark, empty space, but this time, there were more people. Lawyers, detectives, the cold faces of those who had come to witness the final chapter of her story. They didn't speak to her immediately. Instead, they gave her a moment, as if they were giving her a chance to realize the gravity of the situation. But Samantha didn't need time to understand. She already knew. Her fate had been sealed the moment she crossed the line. And now, there was only one thing left to do. Face the consequences. However unbearable they might be, Samantha stood silently in the room, the weight of the eyes upon her almost unbearable. The sterile, fluorescent lights above felt blinding, too harsh for her fragile mind to process. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear into the shadows, but there was no escaping the reality that surrounded her. The lawyer seated at the table flipped through papers, his face impassive, but she could feel the tension in the air. They were ready to begin. She wasn't sure what they expected her to say, what they wanted from her. But there was nothing left in her to give. One of the detectives finally spoke, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Samantha West, you understand the charges against you?" She nodded slowly, unable to find her voice. She had understood them the moment they had been read aloud, each word a heavy weight pressing down on her. The room was suffocating. The air felt thick, as though it was closing in around her, and each breath she took seemed to get harder. The thoughts in her mind, the remorse and guilt, were louder than any words that could be spoken. But she couldn't run from it. She couldn't undo what had been done. And so, as much as it hurt, she forced herself to listen, to face the reality of the situation. "Samantha," the lawyer said, his tone softer now, as if trying to offer some measure of comfort, though it didn't reach her. "There are opportunities for rehabilitation. There are people who can help you through this." Help her through what? What was left to fix? She had destroyed everything, destroyed herself. The thought of redemption felt so distant, so out of reach. How could she find any path back to forgiveness when the damage was so great? The detective continued, speaking in terms of procedures and legal jargon, but Samantha wasn't really listening anymore. Her mind was elsewhere, back with her children, her husband, faces that felt like ghosts now, unreachable, untouchable. How would they ever see her again? How could they ever see her as anything other than the woman who betrayed them? The words blurred into the background as her thoughts consumed her. The detective paused, perhaps sensing that she wasn't absorbing anything he was saying. There was a long silence. "Ms. West," he said quietly, "this is your chance. But you have to understand that it won't be easy." She couldn't respond. The words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded, feeling the weight of her guilt pressing harder, the crushing knowledge that she was facing a future built on her own broken choices. The officers made their preparations, the time for decisions fast approaching. As they gathered the paperwork, one of them glanced at her with a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Pity, maybe, or something else that made her stomach turn. She wanted to scream, to tell them all how sorry she was, but the words felt meaningless now. There was no way to take back the damage, no way to undo the harm she had caused. Samantha stood, the room spinning around her. She walked towards the door with heavy steps, each movement a reminder of what lay ahead. No more false hope. No more waiting for the situation to fix itself. She had done this, and now, the world would be forced to reckon with her actions. The door closed behind her, with an unsettling finality. The sound of the door closing behind her was like a loud exclamation in the stillness, a final punctuation marking the end of everything she had known. Samantha was led back down the cold hallway, the echo of her footsteps now a harsh reminder of the life she had left behind. The officers didn't speak to her, and she didn't speak to them. There was nothing left to say. Her mind remained numb, disconnected from the physical world, as if her body was just going through the motions while her soul remained locked in an endless loop of regret. They reached her cell once more, and the officer opened the door with a mechanical click. Samantha stepped inside, the cold, sterile air rushing to greet her like an old, unwelcome companion. The door clanged shut again, and the familiar isolation crept in, wrapping its cold fingers around her once more. She sank down onto the bed, though it felt like the weight of the world was still pressing down on her chest. She had hoped, somewhere deep inside, that the events of the past days might have been some kind of nightmare, some tragic mistake she could wake up from. But there was no awakening. There was no escape. Her gaze shifted to the small window high up on the wall, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. It was so far out of reach, like everything else in her life now, out of her grasp, distant and untouchable. Samantha lay back, staring up at the ceiling, the dull hum of the lights above a constant presence in the otherwise silent room. She wanted to shut it all out. She wanted to erase the images of her children's faces, the sound of their cries, the look of confusion in their eyes. But no matter how hard she tried, they lingered, imprinted on her mind like a scar she could never heal. Her mind drifted again to the moment everything had changed. The argument, the decisions that followed, each one more reckless than the last, and the unbearable realization that at that moment, she had become someone else, someone unrecognizable. But now here she was, no more choices, no more chances to change her path. Her body felt like it was sinking deeper into the mattress, the weight of everything around her suffocating, relentless. And yet, in the deep recesses of her mind, something stirred, a quiet whisper of realization. She might never be able to undo what she had done. She might never be able to look her children in the eye again, to earn back their trust, or the trust of anyone else. But for the first time since everything had started, a strange thought flickered in her mind. Maybe, just maybe, the path she would walk from now on wasn't solely defined by what she had lost. Maybe there was still some fragment of redemption left, however small, however distant. The thought was fleeting, quickly drowned by the tidal wave of guilt and despair that had consumed her from the moment she made those first choices. But for that brief second, it was enough to make her wonder, was there still a sliver of hope in the broken pieces of her life? Samantha closed her eyes and exhaled, the long, drawn-out breath barely a whisper. She didn't have the answer, and perhaps she never would. But for now, all she could do was wait, trapped in her own mind, in her own choices. And as the hours stretched on, the cold, dimly lit room seemed to close in tighter. But even in the dark, there was a tiny spark of something, however faint, that kept her anchored in the present. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to carry her through the long road ahead. The days blurred together in the cold, gray walls of the cell, but something had shifted in Samantha. The weight of her actions still hung over her like a dark cloud, but for the first time, she didn't feel completely suffocated by it. The woman who had visited her had offered something she had long thought lost, an ounce of hope. Each morning, as the sun barely rose above the horizon, Samantha would sit by the small window, the faint light illuminating the fragments of her broken world. She still couldn't shake the images of her children, their faces twisted in confusion, but now she understood something she hadn't before. Her journey wasn't just about them, or the people she had wronged. It was about her. It was about facing herself, the woman who had made choices in desperation and pain. And now, she had to be brave enough to face the consequences and learn to move forward, no matter how long it took. The woman's words echoed in her mind. You can move forward one step at a time, and so, she began to do just that. Her first step wasn't grand, wasn't dramatic. It was small, a decision to speak to a counselor, a choice to reflect on the pain she had caused and try to make sense of it. She started writing letters. Not to her children, not yet, but to herself, to the woman she had been before, and the one she hoped to become. Each letter was a release, a shedding of the guilt that had wrapped itself around her heart like a vice. Months passed. The process was slow, painful, and far from linear, but every day, Samantha moved a little bit closer to finding peace. She wrote. She reflected. She accepted the pain, rather than running from it. And then one day, the door to her cell opened again. This time, it wasn't the officer or the woman who had visited her. It was a familiar face, a face she had not seen in what felt like a lifetime. Her daughter. The look in her eyes was guarded, hesitant, but there was something else too. Something that resembled hope. Samantha felt her heart skip. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when she could finally begin to make amends. Her daughter stepped closer, and with a trembling breath, Samantha whispered, "I'm so sorry. For everything." Her daughter didn't say anything at first. She simply reached out, gently touching her mother's hand. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning, and that, Samantha realized, was enough. Not every broken thing could be fixed overnight, but sometimes the smallest steps were the ones that led to the most profound changes. As she sat there, facing the woman she had once been, and the woman she was becoming,